Today, the first deadly strike against American forces since the Israel-Gaza war began. The US president vows to respond. Also ahead, calls for conditions to be imposed on the release of a man jailed for helping Australia's worst serial killers. Neither accessible nor affordable, the competition watchdog calls for government intervention to fix the childcare sector. And Yannick Sinner savours victory after a dramatic comeback in the Australian Open final. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Ros Childs. The US president has vowed to respond after 3 troops were killed in a drone attack on an American base on the border between Jordan and Iran. It's the first time American military personnel have been killed by hostile fire in the Middle East since the start of the Israel-Gaza war. President Joe Biden has blamed Iranian militant groups, with the incident creating fears of inflamed tensions in the region.
The Americans say the attack happened at a base known as Tower 22, right on the Syrian-Jordanian border. It's one of many American bases across the region. There have been dozens of drone and missile attacks in recent months, but no American personnel have been killed until now. Joe Biden, seen here attending church this morning, was quick to point the finger. We know it was carried out by radical Iran-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iraq, he said.
I want to point out that we had a tough day last night in the Middle East. We lost 3 brave souls in an attack on one of our bases. And I'd ask you for a moment's silence for all 3 of those falls.
It's not necessarily a tipping point into uncontrolled escalation between the United States and Iran, but it's another very dangerous step because, as I say, the US will have to respond even more strongly than it's done to previous attacks.
Over the weekend, the Houthis have been launching their own attacks, hitting a tanker in the Gulf of Aden. And last night, a British warship, HMS Diamond, used an air defence missile to bring down a Houthi drone. With British help, the US have been hitting Houthi military targets for a couple of weeks. So far, the Houthis seem undeterred. They say they'll stop attacking ships if and when there's a ceasefire in Gaza. The problems America is dealing with across the region aren't all about Gaza, but the war there has left the whole Middle East a lot more dangerous.
Our North America correspondent Carrington Clark has more analysis on the response from Washington.
The US said that this was an unmanned drone aerial attack, which has resulted in the deaths of 3 American service members. Dozens more have been injured. We don't have the exact number at this point. We have heard from multiple politicians. The current frontrunner, for the Republican nomination, the former president of the United States, Donald Trump, has come out with his own statement on his own social media platform. He says this brazen attack on the United States is yet another horrific and tragic consequence of Joe Biden's weakness and surrender, while Mitch McConnell, who's the Republican leader in the US Senate, says the entire world now watches for signs that the president is finally prepared to exercise American strength to compel Iran to change its behavior. Our enemies are emboldened. There have been direct calls for the US to take action against Iran. We don't yet know what the response from the United States will be. We know that the president is continuing to meet with his national security advisors, including the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State, but we wait to hear what concrete steps they will be taking after this attack in Jordan.
The Palestinian Prime Minister says he's shocked by what he's called the extremely dangerous decision by some countries, including Australia, to suspend their funding to the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians. Israel has alleged 12 of the agency's staff were involved in the October the 7th terrorist attacks. The agency says it has severed ties with the alleged staff members while it investigates the allegations. Our political reporter Chantal Al-Khoury joins us now from Parliament House with more details. Hi, Chantal. So what does this funding pause mean for those who are in Gaza right now?
Well, Ros, this agency supports around 6 million Palestinians in Gaza in the occupied West Bank and also Palestinian refugees in neighbouring countries including Jordan, Syria and Lebanon. And Australia, as you mentioned, is now one of several countries which have decided to pause or stop funding to that organisation. We heard from the Foreign Minister Penny Wong on Saturday when she made the announcement. In a statement, she acknowledged the organisation providing essential and life-saving services in Gaza and welcomed the organisation's response. And during her trip to the Middle East earlier this month, she announced Australia would be giving $21.5 million in humanitarian aid to people in Gaza and abroad. 6 million of that was going to this organisation. That's now been paused. We did also hear from the former chief spokesperson for UNRWA, Chris Gunson. He's described this decision as disproportionate and punitive and said that it will have appalling outcomes. He also said that there are huge questions for the Australian government about what they're trying to achieve, particularly considering that the organisation did step down those people with allegations levelled against them. He also pointed to Australia being a party to the Genocide Convention and questioned whether this was the right decision and reminded Australia that it has a role to play. Here's what he had to say.
One of the so-called provisional measures is that Israel and state parties of the convention, of which Australia, Britain, all those other countries you mentioned, they are all state parties. And that provisional measure said that nobody should take any measures to restrict humanitarian aid. And yet, within a matter of days after that, here we have some of the leading state parties of the Genocide Convention and some of the leading donors to UNRWA actually restricting aid. What does that say about those countries' commitment to the international order, that within really hours of the highest judicial organ of the United Nations calling for aid to go through, here we have some of the leading donors of UNRWA actually suspending aid? That speaks volumes in my mind.
So overall, Chantal, what's been the reaction to this move so far?
Well, Ros, the UN, Palestinian officials and human rights organisations, including the World Health Organization, have called on countries like Australia to reconsider their decision to pause funding, saying that it threatens humanitarian work in the region. The agency chief said it would be immensely irresponsible to sanction an agency and therefore the people that the agency serves because of allegations against some individuals. We did also hear from Federal Minister Anne Ali on Radio National earlier today, saying that the aid to Palestinians must be resumed as soon as possible once the allegations are investigated. She says it's one of the most vital services for people in the region. We also heard from Shadow Home Affairs Minister James Patterson, who says that he supports the decision by the government. And just on Mr Gunnis again, he did mention that it's important to note that Israel has long levelled allegations like this against this particular agency, and after numerous investigations, many have been unfounded.
Chantal, thank you. After 25 years, one of the 4 men convicted for his part in Australia's worst serial killings could be granted freedom within months. Still haunted by the horrific Snowtown murders, families of the victims strongly oppose Mark Ray Haddon's release into the community once he served his full prison sentence. This exclusive Stateline investigation by James Wakelin.
These are the faces of the victims of the so-called Snowtown murders. For every face, there are families that will never fully recover from what was done to their loved ones in one of Australia's most notorious serial killings.
They've suffered and continue to suffer unimaginable trauma. Many still suffer from nightmares, PTSD. Many remain fearful.
Now, almost 25 years after his arrest, one of the perpetrators is set to be freed. Mark Hayden, whose wife Elizabeth was one of the victims, will complete his 25-year sentence in May, and legal experts say there is nothing in the law that prevents his release.
The court has imposed a sentence. Once that sentence is complete, then he would be released from custody.
While his fellow accused, Robert Wagner, John Bunting and James Vlasakis, were convicted of murder, Hayden, who is now 65, was only found to have assisted the offenders, not to have been actively involved in the killings. Sarah Quick is the Victims' Rights Commissioner of South Australia and has spoken to the families impacted by Hayden's offending and impending release.
It's a very universal view. They would prefer he was never to be released.
The horrific crimes were uncovered by detectives who found decomposing bodies in a bank in Snowtown, 150 kilometres north of Adelaide, in May 1999. In total, 8 bodies were identified from the 6 barrels found in the bank. The remains of 3 more victims were discovered elsewhere.
The victims were human beings and their lives were stolen, and their loved ones now live with the loss for the rest of their lives. And that loss carries over generation after generation.
Hayden was given a non-parole period of 18 years. He's twice applied to be given his freedom, and it remains possible that he could still be paroled even before he's completed his jail time. And if he does finish that sentence, it remains an option for the government to apply for an extended supervision order. James Vlasakis, who gave evidence against the other men and pleaded guilty to 4 of the murders, will be eligible to apply for parole next year. For the families of the victims, just facing the thought of Hayden being granted freedom is difficult enough.
They very much feel that they've been given a life sentence.
Both Bunting and Wagner have been told they will never be released on parole. James Wakelin, ABC News.
Reporter Rebecca Bryce has been following the story and she joins us now from Adelaide. Hi Rebecca, so has there been any detail on what the government is planning to do in relation to the Hayden case?
Well, Ros, the Attorney-General has confirmed this morning that the government is seeking advice as to whether it can apply to put an extended supervision order onto Hayden when he is released in May. Now, that will come down to whether the Supreme Court decides whether or not he qualifies under the legislation. He would have to be deemed a high-risk offender. If he is deemed a high-risk offender, they could put similar conditions to parole conditions on him, things like restricting where he can and can't go, who he can and can't see and where he lives. Now, the Premier was also asked this morning whether they're considering legislating to try to keep Hayden in jail. He simply said they're exploring all of their options.
I probably, along with a significant number of South Australians, am genuinely concerned about the prospect of release occurring to anyone associated with the Snowtown murders. These were horrific crimes. They were some of the worst we've ever seen in the history of the nation. So we need to think through our legal options very carefully, and we are exploring each and every one of them, and as that evolves, we will respond accordingly.
Now, the Parole Board has also spoken to us this morning. They have been monitoring Hayden because he has twice applied for parole. The first time he was refused because he needed more socialisation. There's a current application still underway. They say that in custody he's been doing all the things that have been asked of him. He's been completing all of the courses that have been asked of him, and that he's demonstrated remorse and contrition.
A group of neo-Nazis has gathered in locations across Sydney 4 times over the past 4 days. Police dispersed a congregation of about 40 members of the group at a suburban park in the city's north yesterday. Helena Burke joins us now from New South Wales Parliament. Good afternoon, Helena. So what has this neo-Nazi group been doing in Sydney over the past few days?
Well, Ros, the group first gathered on a train on Australia Day, carrying a neo-Nazi sign and later chanting racist slogans. Police intercepted that train at North Sydney and 6 people were arrested. However, no one was charged. The group then tried to gather again at a scout hall in North Turramurra, but were dispersed. On Sunday, we saw about 40 members of that group, dressed all in black, arrive at our Tarman Reserve. The men were there for a short while before police dispersed them. The group then tried to gather once again that afternoon in Western Sydney at a community centre, but were evicted. In response to all of this, police have issued public safety orders to members of the group, banning them from several local government areas across Sydney. The Premier, Chris Minns, has warned that police have the powers to unmask these men, exposing their identities and outing them as racists. Experts have warned, however, that this may not necessarily have the desired effect. Let's have a listen to some of what they had to say.
Look, unmasking people will no doubt feel good when we expose a few people, but what are the long-term possibilities of that? So I think they're twofold. There are some people who are very happy to be unmasked and to be given a sort of notorious statement, to be seen as big guys in this space. For people around the fringes of the movement that may just be beginning to get involved, potentially unmasking them might be counterproductive because it starts then to block their options for leaving these movements behind. So I think, there's never a one-size-fits-all solution.
So where does the government go from here, Helena?
Well, one of the avenues that the Premier says he'll be potentially exploring to deal with this issue is to strengthen anti-vilification laws in New South Wales. And this could see hand signals like the Nazi salute become completely banned. Let's have a listen to what Chris Minns had to say about that earlier today.
Laws that were passed in 2022 ban Nazi symbols being displayed in public or anywhere in the state. Now, that specifically applies to the display of the Nazi flag, the swastika. It's being tested in court whether that existing legislation also applies to hand gestures that may be deployed as a white power salute or some kind of demented fascist ideology. If that legal barrier isn't cleared, we will move legislation to outlaw racist Nazi ideology.
It's understood that the public safety orders banning the members of that group from several LGAs across Sydney have now expired. Police say that the investigation into those 4 gatherings over the past few days is ongoing.
Thanks, Helena. Ex-tropical cyclone Intili has moved west and has been sitting over parts of western and northwest Queensland. Some of the biggest falls have been around Middleton and Kainoona, where hundreds of millimetres of rain has fallen since Friday. Grace Nakamura joins us from Longreach, which is east of the area receiving the heavy rainfall. Hi there, Grace. So it doesn't look like there's much rain where you are, but how much rain have some graziers seen?
G'day, Roz. You wouldn't be able to tell from the blue skies behind me, but just 2 hours from here, the sky looks completely different. Some graziers have had more rain in the past 24 hours than they have in the whole year. Now, parts of Middleton near Winton have had over 400 millimetres of rain in just over this weekend alone. Now, while that rain is quite welcome for a lot of these outback towns, there are some concerns it could be too much of a good thing, with many remembering the impacts of the 2019 flood. We've spoken to a few locals on remote properties out here. They say their place looks almost a bit like a beachfront, and they've told us they could be cut off from town from anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, but they're well equipped to burrow down and do so.
And how much more rain is expected in the area, Grace?
The Weather Bureau has issued a severe weather warning with heavy rainfall for parts of Central West, Northwest, Channel Country, Northern Goldfields and Upper Flinders out here. So more heavy rain is expected over the coming days as ex-tropical cyclone Intili sits over this northwest part of the state, and that system is expected to dump anywhere from 90 millimetres to over 200 millimetres of rain. Now, there are flood warnings in a lot of the western rivers out here, particularly the Diamantina River, and motorists are being urged to check for warnings before hitting the roads, as many of these roads are flooded or completely cut off. For example, Winton to Cloncurry or Winton to Boulia is currently cut off at the moment.
Grace, thank you. Following the Child Abuse Royal Commission several years ago, the Jehovah's Witnesses Church committed to mandatory reporting of alleged sex abuse to police. But it can be revealed the church is still dealing with historical abuse cases with their own internal investigations behind closed doors. It's prompted one survivor to call for that to change. A warning that this story contains content that may be confronting for some viewers.
Kezia Witten fears the Jehovah's Witnesses are still hiding child sexual abuse.
You're a survivor every day you survive.
The 34-year-old from regional Western Australia grew up in the Jehovah's Witnesses faith, which believes Armageddon is imminent. But there was a far greater threat inside her family home. About 3 decades ago, aged just 5, Kezia Witten was sexually abused by her brother, Joel Witten, who was over 18 at the time.
He should have been hurting for me, not hurting me. Nothing like that should ever happen to a child, ever.
It left her with deep emotional scars and trauma.
I was pretty committed to killing myself.
Kezia confronted Joel later in life, and he confessed to the Jehovah's Witnesses elders in 2018, following the Royal Commission into child sexual abuse, but the elders chose to conduct their own investigation and not report the matter to police. This was despite the faith group committing to report child sexual abuse during the inquiry. Kezia then decided to report the matter to police herself after having a child of her own, and Joel pleaded guilty and was jailed late last year. The Jehovah's Witnesses didn't respond to all questions, they say, to protect the privacy of those involved, but say they regard child abuse as a crime and abhorrent sin. WA's mandatory reporting laws don't require religious organisations to report historical abuse which occurred before 2022, even if the survivor is still currently a child. It's something survivors like Kezia Witten want changed, but the state government says the laws were not intended to address historical abuse. With her abuser now jailed, Kezia has started making candles to help her find the light in her life.
I think it's knowing that you're a lot more than what hurt you, instead of letting it consume you completely.
She says other survivors shouldn't give up hope. Brianna Fiore, ABC News.
And if you need information or support, you can contact Beyond Blue on 1300 22 46 36. Or if you or someone you know is experiencing distress, please contact Lifeline on 13 11 14. Brisbane is leading the country in the cost of living crisis, according to a new report by the Queensland Council of Social Service. The state has seen the highest rent, energy, health and insurance hikes in the past year. With more, reporter Michael Rennie joins us. Hi, Michael. So what's come out in this report?
Hi, Ros. Well, this Living Affordability in Queensland report looks into the lowest income earners in Queensland to see if they can actually afford to live in the state at the present moment in the circumstances that we're facing, and I think it's pretty obvious that it's found that most of the people who are on low incomes cannot afford their lifestyle, going into debt every single week, and only of the modelled households that were put forward, only 1 in 5 was actually found to be able to afford living standards at the moment on a low income, and that was a senior couple. So every other household was going into debt every single week. It's found that households or housing is taking up 40% of household expenditure. Brisbane leads the nation also in the highest rent, energy, insurance and health price increases. Look, inflation, of course, also has had a massive impact on living pressures. But all up, Ros, 300,000 Queenslanders are experiencing housing stress today. So we heard a little bit earlier on from Amy McVeigh. She's the CEO of the Queensland Council of Social Service.
Last year, the state government delivered a $14 billion surplus. That's the biggest budget surplus delivered by any state or territory government ever. So it is the case that we have a golden opportunity here in Queensland. There is an opportunity to share our wealth with all Queenslanders. There is an opportunity for urgent and immediate relief through further energy bill concessions, investing in emergency food relief services and putting a brake on rent increases.
Yes, the Queensland Council of Social Services CEO, and the council is also calling for other measures as well to be put in place to actually accelerate building housing in Queensland for low-income households, and that's something that can also really have an impact on I guess the pressures that people are under at the moment.
Michael, thank you. Time for finance news now with David Chow. Hi there, David. Let's start with the markets then. How's the week starting?
Well, the market's risen very slightly today by a tiny fraction, so it's a pretty cautious day because investors are waiting for some key economic data, which is really important data, I should say, that's coming out later this week. Before I get into that, let's take a quick look at the figures. The All Ords and ASX 200 up by 0.2%, so very small gains there. But in context, the market's risen for 6 days in a row, and because of that optimism streak, it's close to hitting a record high for the first time in 2.5 years. Now, today's best performing stocks include Core Lithium and Woodside Energy. Meanwhile, shares of Gold Road Resources have plunged by more than 14%, making it today's worst performing stock. And that's after the company announced a big drop in gold production at its mine site in WA. In currencies, the Aussie dollar is down slightly. It's buying 65.8 US cents. While let's take a look in commodity markets, there's been a big jump in oil prices, up 1.3% for Brent crude as conflict in the Middle East intensifies, while the price of gold is hovering around 2018 US dollars an ounce, Ros.
So you mentioned important economic figures, so they're due out later this week. What are we waiting on?
So the key thing is the inflation figures for the December quarter. So that's October, November, December. The ABS will release these on Wednesday. Now that's the data the Reserve Bank will be looking very closely at to determine whether it lifts interest rates above a 12-year high in the coming months. So the objective is to, I guess, make us feel poorer and spend less at the shops of these rate increases, and it will be felt especially hard by those paying off an expensive mortgage. So when we look back at where we were in the September quarter, inflation at 5.4%, which is around a 20-year high. So December quarter figures, economists are being polled by various news organisations that expect that to drop to 4.3%, which would be a 15-year high. Still much too high, but a step in the right direction, Ros. So 4.3, that's the key number to look out for quarterly inflation. If it's higher than that, that increases the chance of a rate hike. But if it comes in lower than that, then that's good news. That means the cost of living crisis is easing faster than expected, and so that would increase the chance of a rate cut by the end of this year. Which would also boost share markets closer to a record high and probably, unfortunately, increase property prices too for those trying to get into the market. Now, the other thing I want to mention, Thursday morning, the US Federal Reserve will meet. They are the biggest central bank in the world, and what happens in the US economy, very important to what happens in every other economy, including ours. So the expectation is the Fed will keep rates on hold around a 20-year high, but what's more important is their outlook, whether they give any updates or hints about how many interest rate cuts there'll be in America for the rest of this year. And because of these expectations of aggressive rate cuts, at least 3 this year in America, that's what's been boosting Wall Street. So on that note, let's take a look at the US market figures, where the Dow Jones rose by a tiny fraction last Friday. The S&P 500 pretty much flat, while the Nasdaq fell slightly by 0.4%. So as I mentioned, the US stock market is near a record high on expectations of a soft landing, no recession, and aggressive rate cuts later this year. And Ros, that is the latest in finance news.
Thanks, David. Have you ever wondered why the Australian accent differs so much, not only between regions, but even within local areas? From a broad-talking Queenslander to a posh-sounding South Australian, there's plenty of variety in the humble Aussie drawl. And as Angus McIntosh discovered, even Victorians can't agree on how to say Melbourne.
Ah, good day. How you going?
Everything, mate. Good mates, good times, having a great time, mate. Yeah, we're good mates.
You know it when you hear it, right? The Aussie accent. If you know Australians or you are Australian, you've heard the voice. But you're not crazy if you think there might be little differences in the way Aussies speak around the country and between generations. Some of our top linguists agree.
It may be that this country will become the most valuable acquisition Britain has ever made.
This paper looks at 4 parts of Victoria, Australia's most densely populated state, to see if there's any difference in the way people speak from one end to the other. It looks at one of the most characteristic accent features of that state, the one that makes Victorians say Melbourne instead of Melbourne or Melbourne, and showed that in the state's north, it's dying out. But in the south, in the city of Melbourne itself and on the coastal town of Warrnambool, it's getting stronger. Merging the L and L sounds is just one of the changes happening around Australia right now. Where I'm from in Western Australia, here is a word with 2 syllables. In New South Wales, it might just have 1. Let's start with this one. Just read it out and then read it down into the camera.
There's no chance of clear skies here in Melbourne, but here we feel like going to the pool.
There's no chance of clear skies in Melbourne, but here we feel like going to the pool.
There's no chance of clear skies in Melbourne, but here we feel like going to the pool.
Linguists stop short of calling these all new accents, and for good reason. But you're not alone if you've noticed the little differences when they do appear. Around Australia, people take a lot of pride in their lingo and particular accent, and they're not above having a bit of fun with other Aussies on the subject.
Most Queenslanders tend to say France, demand,
command. It's not demand, command, France, because we don't want to sound like a wanker.
When I went to Queensland, I had to get a bit nasally. Victorian, they speak. There's a little bit of an ochre twang to it, and in Sydney, it's a tiny bit stuffy.
Generally, no, I don't think people say, "Oh, you're from Melbourne," when I'm talking to them. I feel like it's a more gentle Australian accent, if there's such a thing.
Australian accent, a bloody good accent.
You can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. US President Joe Biden has vowed to respond after 3 service members were killed in a drone attack on US forces stationed in Jordan. They are the first US military fatalities in the Middle East in response to the Israel-Gaza war. Mr. Biden has accused Iran-backed militias carrying out the attack. A man sentenced over South Australia's infamous bodies in the barrels case could be freed from jail with no restrictions within months. Mark Ray Hayden, now aged 61, was sentenced to 25 years for assisting the disposal of the bodies of 7 of the 11 victims in the Snowtown murders. His sentence is due to expire in May. The state government says it's seeking legal advice on the matter. The consumer watchdog is calling on all levels of government to consider intervening in the childcare market so that all families can access services. After a year-long review, the ACCC has found that for many households, childcare is neither affordable nor accessible, and that historically the government's childcare subsidy has had little effect in keeping prices low. And Jannik Sinner is savouring victory after claiming his first Grand Slam title at the Australian Open. The Italian came back from 2 sets to love down to beat Russia's Daniela Medvedev in the thrilling decider. The 22-year-old is the 3rd Italian to win a men's major title and the first since 1976. 3 US troops have been killed and dozens more have been injured in a drone attack in Jordan, the first deadly strike on American forces in the region since the Israel-Gaza war broke out in October. The attack took place on a remote military base known as Tower 22 in the country's northeast near the border with Syria. US President Joe Biden is blaming Iran-backed militant groups operating in Syria and Iraq and has vowed to hold those responsible to account. The incident further stokes tensions in the region.
US casualties was always seen as a red line. US deaths. In all of these attacks that we've seen on various US interests, US bases, minor injuries, people targeted who weren't actually US citizens, this is the tipping point. So 3 US soldiers' deaths is important. It's not necessarily a tipping point into uncontrolled escalation between the United States and Iran, but it's another very dangerous step.
In Gaza, people displaced by the war say they're disheartened by the decision by at least 9 countries, including Australia, to pause funding for the UN Refugee Agency for Palestinians. Israel alleges 12 of the organisation's staff in the territory were involved in the October the 7th attack on southern Israel. Gazans forced into camps near Khan Yunis say the agency is their lifeline.
The situation we live in right now has support from all the world. The whole world is responsible for the situation that we are living in right now. It is the world that cuts the aid from children and women. We are not talking only food, we are also talking on cutting medicine. What is our fault as a Palestinian people? Our land has been occupied, our houses have been destroyed, and we have been through many wars, and this is the worst.
Palestinian officials are calling on the countries to reconsider the funding suspension. While the agency's former chief spokesman says the Australian government is penalising the most vulnerable caught up in the 3.5-month conflict.
The biggest question for the Australian government is why are you punishing for the sum of about $15 million, a lot of money, I know, and it's hugely appreciated. It does a huge amount of work on the ground. Why are you punishing the most desperate, the most needy people, possibly in the Middle East today, people who are underneath these 2,000-pound bombs?
As talks continue for a ceasefire, hundreds of Israeli protesters have blocked the delivery of humanitarian aid trucks into Gaza for a third consecutive day. Families of the more than 100 hostages still held in the Strip are demanding their loved ones are released, arguing aid going to the territory only helps Hamas.
Giving Hamas food, water, and fuel is something that allows the war to continue. And if the world wants the suffering of the Gazans to end, we have to end this war quickly. And this just prolongs the war.
Thousands of people across Germany have joined protests against the rise of the far right, sparked by activists allegedly discussing the mass deportation of immigrants, even if they hold citizenship. The controversy has prompted questions of the far right Alternative for Deutschland party, which is growing in popularity by capitalising on concerns about the economy and immigration.
In her 80s, but undaunted by a crowd, Renata speaks at one of the many protests sweeping Germany. She survived the Holocaust. Many of her Jewish family did not.
It's very important that we Jews raise our voice. The situation in Germany has become threatening because of Alternative for Deutschland and other far-right groups, not just for us Jews.
These demos were sparked by revelations that senior figures from the Alternative for Deutschland party met with right-wing extremists, where the mass deportation of asylum seekers and so-called non-Germans was allegedly discussed.
There's a debate about whether to ban the AfD or deprive them of state funding. Where do you stand on that?
I'm against the ban of AfD. I think we have to tackle them on a political way, because if we ban them, I fear that they attract more attention and that more people try to support them.
For all these shows of staunch mass resistance against the AfD, there is great uncertainty, even a nervousness about how to tackle the rise of the far right, particularly here in Germany's east.
A sense of disaffection lingers in the once communist part of this country, where the AfD's leading the polls ahead of key elections.
They never had a chance to be in power because no one wants to work with them. Maybe if they got into power, it would be good for us.
The AfD, designated by domestic intelligence as extremist in Saxony, says it's being smeared by its opponents.
What do you think about the fact there are hundreds of thousands of people protesting against your party, and some people at those demonstrations saying they're scared by what they've heard?
We're aware of it, but we believe that many of these demonstrators don't know our program. We're in the absurd situation where people demonstrate with the government against the opposition. That's unheard of.
This city of Chemnitz was once named after Karl Marx. That was reversed, but the monument remains. The father of communism now watching over the rise of the far right.
A year-long inquiry into the childcare market by the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission has found what many parents and carers have long felt, that it's neither accessible nor affordable. The report says the government's changes have improved the situation, but warns that rising costs could wipe out those gains. Georgie Dent is Executive Director of the Parenthood, a community support organisation for parents and carers. Georgie, welcome. So what do you make of this report?
Good afternoon, Ros. Look, the report from the ACCC is incredibly comprehensive, and it does, as you say, reflect what many parents and families and indeed educators and carers know, and that is that the system is not universally accessible or affordable. It acknowledges that in a country like Australia, where we have got so many different locations and communities with different needs, one size fits all is not going to be adequate to ensure that children, regardless of their postcode or their parents' income, have access to the quality early childhood education and care that we know sets them up for a lifelong positive trajectory.
So for people who don't have kids or don't have kids in childcare right now, can you give us an idea of the cost of childcare and also the availability of services?
Yeah, so look, the cost does really vary, and the ACCC has found this. The cost, the out-of-pocket cost for parents, it varies wildly, but what it found was that the cost is still it is disproportionately a barrier for families on lower incomes. So as a proportion of disposable incomes, those families on lower incomes are spending the most, and therefore it is creating the most amount of difficulty for those families. This report shows that it is children, in particular First Nations children, children who live in remote communities, and children from lower socioeconomic households that tend to miss out because of either the cost or the accessibility of early education and care. So in Australia, we have got, in our capital cities, we do have early learning services where the daily fee could be in excess of $180, $190, even $200 a day. Families are entitled to a subsidy. Most families are entitled to some subsidy, so that's not the full cost that parents are paying. But we know that it is prohibitively expensive. We know that the high cost is why Australia's female participation, workforce participation, is peculiarly low. We have a lot of highly educated, skilled women in Australia who only work part-time, and not because that is their free and fully formed choice, but because they simply cannot either afford or access early education on those additional days.
So, Georgie, one of the big takeouts from this report has been the call for direct intervention by the government in the childcare market. Do you want to see that? What difference would that make?
Look, at The Parenthood, we have long campaigned for a paradigm shift when it comes to how we deliver and fund early childhood education and care. We know that between 0 and 5, 90% of brain development occurs. So we know that we have to start looking at the early years as a formal and critically important component of our education system, and we need to fund it differently. So the ACCC has called for a paradigm shift and has specifically said that funding a subsidy, for example, is not enough to ensure that nationally every child can access early education and care. The ACCC has recommended that additional funding mechanisms be looked at, including things like government-funded services, and looking into what that might look like, because we know that since the childcare subsidy was introduced, and as you said, the changes that this federal government have made have reduced out-of-pocket fees by about 11% for children that are in long daycare services, and that is welcome financial relief for families. But what we know the childcare subsidy hasn't done, and indeed can't do, according to the ACCC, is put meaningful downward pressure on prices over the long term. And we've also seen that it can't influence supply. And so we know that the childcare subsidy is not an effective tool at addressing accessibility. So we know that over 30% of families in Australia live in what is described as a childcare desert, where there are 3 or more children for every position that's available within a 20-minute drive. So for a lot of families, the childcare subsidy doesn't fix that issue for them. And the ACCC has recommended that the government's role be broader than funding the childcare subsidy alone.
Georgie Dent, thank you.
Thanks, Ros.
Politicians and political junkies alike will be glued to their TV sets tonight for the start of the ABC's landmark documentary Nemesis. The series will take viewers inside 9 years of the coalition government and its revolving door of prime ministers. It's promising to drop plenty of bombshells. Let's take a look.
Take one. Scott Morrison, why did you want to run for federal politics?
Service.
Well, Malcolm Turnbull, why so determined to enter politics?
It was genuinely a commitment to public service.
To my party, which has given me the privilege to serve, my heartfelt thanks.
In looking at the 9 years in power and our 3 prime ministers, the playing of politics was always the number 1 game, number 2 game, and number 3 game. It's not productive and it's not edifying.
The prime ministership of this country is not a prize or a plaything.
When enmity, when ambition, and when distrust take hold, it can be very damaging.
This is my leader.
There you go. And I'm ambitious for him.
While that internal war was going on, it was like being strapped to a suicide bomber. Something horrific and catastrophic was going to happen. You can see it coming. You wish they wouldn't do it, but they do it anyway.
And the first episode of Nemesis premieres tonight at 8 on ABC TV and on iView. With fuel efficiency standards now just around the corner, Australia's most popular car maker is pushing vehicles fuelled by hydrogen. Toyota's big bet is being panned by some critics, but the Japanese company is staying firm and it's lobbying for government investment. Amelia Turzon has this story.
This might look like a petrol pump, but actually it is full of hydrogen. It was made here at this facility using power from solar panels that are over there and power from the grid, making the hydrogen in this close to so-called green energy. It takes around 5 minutes to fill up a car like this, and that will get you around 650 kilometres. So the technology under the hood looks a little bit similar to an internal combustion engine that runs on petrol or diesel, but technically this is not an engine. The hydrogen is going into this fuel cell. That then generates electricity, which runs this motor. They run pretty quiet and are actually really similar to a pure electric battery vehicle. Just like an EV, there is no tailpipe on this car. Toyota says that all that's emitted is water vapour, which comes out somewhere under here, and apparently is so clean you could water the garden with it, or even, as some people have done, you could drink it. These cars are still really expensive to run, and there is not many places in Australia to refuel them. Just 6 hydrogen cars were sold into the Australian market last year. That compares to 87,000 electric cars and even more hybrids.
The number's still quite small, and that's on the basis that the refuelling infrastructure is limited.
Toyota says that these sorts of cars are still a really good option for people who don't want to have to wait to charge up their battery electric cars, but there are lots of skeptics like the Grattan Institute who says that we shouldn't be wasting our energy on these sorts of cars.
You need to be able to make electricity to make the hydrogen really, really, really cheap. And the thing is that when electricity gets really cheap, it becomes even cheaper to run your electric car.
A report from Amelia Turzon. Well, many parts of Queensland are still dealing with the impacts of ex-tropical cyclone Kirrily. It's the second extreme weather event to hit the state this season after Cyclone Jasper brought devastating wind and rain in December. But what effect have these back-to-back storms had on the Great Barrier Reef? Dr. Jessica Stella is from the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, and she joins us now. Very good to see you, Jessica. Thanks for your time. So how have these 2 cyclones left the reef? How much damage has been done?
Well, since the cyclone Kirrily just crossed the coast on Thursday in the Townsville area, so just north of Townsville, as a Category 2, we haven't been able to get into the water to actually look at what the impacts might have been. We do have an idea of what they potentially were, given the size of the cyclone, the wind speed, and what the damaging waves that they can generate. So that's most concerning underwater. We're most concerned with the wind speeds being on land, but underwater, the cyclonic waves can really bash fish around, damage corals, break corals off the seafloor. So they can cause quite a bit of damage, but it all depends on how fast they're traveling, what category they are when they cross, and as well as how big those systems are.
So you haven't been able to check the damage from Kirrily, but what about Jasper?
So with Cyclone Jasper, it crossed the reef in mid-December as a Category 2. It did generate a lot of damaging waves that might have affected about 20% of the coral reefs within the marine park. We did see some damage of coral colonies on the more exposed sides of the reefs, so breaking off of branches and removing the corals from the substrate. The damage wasn't too bad, however, so we're kind of lucky that it was only a Category 2. We did have a lot of freshwater inflow resulting from the heavy rainfall with Jasper, and that probably had more of an effect on those inshore reefs and the shallow reef environments. Freshwater can be lethal to marine life, so exposure to freshwater can cause coral bleaching or death, and also affect the other marine life, such as fish. So we did see a bit of that.
Sorry to interrupt. Did each cyclone hit a different part of the reef then, Jessica?
Yeah. Given the size of the marine park, one thing that we are quite lucky to have such, it's the biggest coral reef ecosystem in the world, is that cyclones and other events don't affect the same parts over and over. So Jasper crossed in the northern Great Barrier Reef. Most of the impacts that we saw were off of Port Douglas and down south and the northern catchments, as well as the exposed reefs on the outer Great Barrier Reef. Cyclone Carolee crossed just north of Townsville on Thursday night, so different part of the reef, and it moved quite quickly. So that is actually good news for reefs, that it doesn't sit over the reef and generate those damaging waves for a really long time. And we didn't get the heavy rainfall south of the cyclone as we usually see. So we're still waiting to look at what the impacts of any freshwater runoff might have been. But given it was a Category 2 when it crossed, and it crossed the reef quite quickly, we're expecting minimal damage from that.
So if we're going to see more cyclones, it seems inevitable now and in the seasons to come, any way the reef can be protected?
So we can't prevent cyclones from happening. We can't stop them once they are already in play. What we can do is build more resilience into the coral reef system. So by reducing pressures such as the crown of thorns starfish that loves to eat coral, illegal fishing we can address. So if we can reduce the other pressures that we can control and hopefully build resilience into the system so that the impacts of these cyclones are more recoverable, I guess, then that actually helps to resist and to keep the function of the ecosystem going, even though we might have some localized damage. So it's really important that we're still addressing all those other pressures on the reef, that we can actually help the reef be more resilient going into the future.
Dr. Jessica Stella, thank you.
Thank you.
Now for sport, here's Daniela Intili. Hi, Danny. So a maiden Grand Slam title for Yannick Sinner.
A lot of proud Italians, can I tell you? My dad loves the soccer, but the first thing he said to me, an Italian won the Australian Open. He's the first Italian to win an Australian Open singles title, the youngest as well. He's 22 from his country, and what an astonishing comeback it was against the world number 3, Daniil Medvedev, coming back from 2-0 to win in this epic match that it was. He thanked his parents as well, who at just 14 years of age gave him permission to leave home so he could pursue a tennis career. Pretty extraordinary. And he also praised his Australian coach, Darren Cahill. So good to see that there's a bit of an Aussie touch to this historic victory. And Yannick spoke while he was presenting the trophy. Here's a bit of what he had to say.
I didn't sleep much, but it's, great emotions, slowly realizing what I've done. It's a great achievement for me and my team, so really happy to be here.
And the Australian Open has come under fire for some of the scheduling and those late finishes, and the boss, Craig Tiley, he addressed that today by saying he wanted to diminish lets. He wanted lets removed from the game because he thinks that this will save a lot of time. Here's Craig Tiley speaking.
The extra time that it took over these 2 weeks of the event was over 15 hours. So it's significant. It takes an average of 18 seconds every time you got to replay, you have a let. And remember, it's a let after the serve.
On to soccer then, Danny. Australia has secured a consecutive quarter-final berth at the Asian Cup.
Yeah, a 4-0 win against Indonesia. So they move into the quarterfinals. Jackson Irvine, he forced an own goal in the 12th minute, so that's Australia went one up. Then Martin Boyle, he doubled the lead with a lovely diving header in the 45th minute. Craig Goodwin, he returned from injury, added a third one in the 89th, and then Harry Suter buried one in injury time. So Australia will take on either Saudi Arabia or South Korea in the last 8.
We expected that. It's probably, we can do better in every aspect, and after, I'll go and watch a review. Obviously, we'll review what we can do better.
And which is the first team through to the 2024 Super Bowl, Danny?
Ros, it is the Kansas City Chiefs that are the first team to progress, beating the Baltimore Ravens 17 points to 10 in the AFC Championship game in Baltimore. Travis Kelce and Isaiah Pacheco scored, and you can see Kelce's girlfriend Taylor Swift there cheering him in the box. It was a dominant performance from the Chiefs. It is a fourth Super Bowl in 5 years, and they also won the Super Bowl last year. And they'll play either the San Francisco 49ers or Detroit Lions. The Lions had a healthy 24-7 lead at halftime in their clash.
And Australia has won netball's Nations Cup.
Yeah, it was a replay of last year's World Cup final against England, and the Diamonds prevailed 69-49 in the final in lead. So it's a second consecutive final victory against England. Sophie Garben, she was named Player of the Match. She hit 31 goals from 32 attempts, and centre Paige Hadley was named the Player of the Series. So the Diamonds, they are world champions, they are Commonwealth Games champions, and have won every trophy contested since 2022. Here is the coach, Stacey Marinkovic.
I knew that we were really focused on the hard work. I think they pride themselves in it. We knew it's hard to win here, it's hard to win international netball, and that's been our theme for this game. And I thought they came out of the blocks hard, and, you know, we built momentum.
And that's all in sport.
Thanks, Danny. Well, it's a story that sounds like fiction. A group of friends start a local football team in England and rise to stratospheric heights. As Elias Clure reports, the Dorking Wanderers are showing the world how it's done.
30 kilometres from the centre of London, a football fairy tale in the making.
£5 a goal from now, paid Saturday. Oh, yes!
This is Mark White and his unlikely, rough-around-the-edges success story, the Dorking Wanderers.
Me and my mates, we were going to Premier League football, and we got a bit bored of it, and we just thought we'd start playing, have a fun side on a Saturday. It was just a social thing. We was in basically the equivalent of like Division 17.
The affable Londoner working a 9-to-5 job started what's known as a park team, social football anyone can play. Dorking kept winning, being promoted to higher and higher leagues, right up to the semi-professional National Conference League.
We've had 12 promotions, we've done really well. I've learned an awful lot as I've gone along.
Despite having no experience in coaching, Mark's colourful management style has not only been successful, it's earned him a worldwide following. Dorking's behind-the-scenes TikTok has over 17 million likes.
You must be bored. You must be bored. Whatever, mate. Not been at school or something.
As Dorking grows into a formidable football force, Mark continues to own, run and coach the club.
So Dorking's gone from playing on a park to a relatively impressive field, but its next step will be its biggest one yet, to the EFL, which is home to the biggest and richest clubs in England.
We just want to keep driving forward and embracing people on our journey, you know?
The Wanderers are daring to dream of one day reaching the Premier League. Elias Clure, ABC News, Dorking.
That's ABC News for now. A reminder, you can keep up to date on all the latest news across all your devices at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Ros Childs. Thanks for your company.